In this video, I look at 8 different ways to hold a watercolour brush. Before we even start at looking how to hold a brush, it's important to say there's no right or wrong way. At the end of the day, you hold the brush however you feel most comfortable. Some of these techniques work better if you think about holding and using the brush in a particular way. Now when I'm working on my paintings for all the detail I like to paint, I like to hold the brush really low down to that metal ferrule. At least that way around I feel I've got more control over the brush. That enables me to really pick out the fine details as well. Obviously that will depend on how much paint you put on the brush as well, depends on how fine those details will be. But you find that by holding your brush really low down, you'll be able to control the flow of that brush. You'll be able to control the way that the paint is deposited onto the paper as well. So remember, by holding the brush really low down, quite close to that metal ferrule, will give you much finer, tighter details. Now another way is by holding the brush further along that handle, so further away from the metal ferrule. So instead of a really kind of fine, tight style, this will give you much looser feel, much looser kind of control of the brush. So this gives you a bit more freedom as well actually. So when you're working on a large painting, especially on a large background like this particular one, you can see that because you're holding the brush further away from the metal ferrule, is that your hand feels really loose, so don't grip it too tight, and then utilise that freedom that you've got within that brush. Try to not paint any tight details using this technique, because this is meant to be a very loose way of painting. And also, actually it can be very expressive as well. So remember, holding the brush further away from that metal ferrule will give you a much looser feel, and for me that's perfect for working with those loose mottled backgrounds. Now notice with this elephant's trunk that I'm just using the very tip of this brush. I find that it depends as well on the bristles that you use. Are they sable? Are they synthetic? And for me, if it's a synthetic bristle, then I find that it forms that lovely shape as you pull away, as you lift off to create those fine marks. But of course, all brushes tend to vary for this effect. So try to use the lightest of touches when you work with fine lines. And just remember that when you do reduce that pressure on your brush tip, your lines will get even finer. So test this out with your own brushes and see how fine you can paint your lines. Now when you increase the pressure on the brush, that will obviously in turn give you a much thicker line to work with. But by doing this you can really vary the thickness of the line. So I increase the pressure when I want to work with woodwork like on this chipmunk here as you can see. And by doing so you can really get some different effects to that particular area that you're working on. So increase that pressure and that will widen that line as well. And also remember to kind of have different amounts of paint on your brush when you're doing this. So if you have a more loaded brush, you'll also have a much thicker line when you start to increase the pressure. So I would recommend to you to play with your brush by applying more pressure and see the effects that you can get. And also don't forget to change both the consistency of paint and the amount of paint that you use when you decide to apply that little bit more pressure using your brush. Now let's look at the last 2 techniques I've been talking about. So this way, what we're going to do, looking at the whiskers I'm going to work for this chipmunk, I'm going to start off with a thicker line, then lift off that pressure. Okay, so starting thick, then lift off to a tapered point. And this to me is a much more natural way of showing the whiskers on something like a chipmunk or any animal really. So you see what I mean if I just do small lines on this test piece of paper here, is that you can just vary the thickness all the time. So you can start off by using a thinner line, gradually thicken it by applying the pressure, then lift off that pressure again to get a thinner tip to it. Or you can start off with more pressure to begin with, and like the whiskers here, and then simply just lift that brush off gradually as you pull away from the painting. That's it really, and that'll give you a nice tapered tip to that line. So remember, play with the different pressures, try this out on some scrap watercolour paper first before you go to your main project. Now one of the techniques I do like to do is called stippling. I know, stippling. And all I simply do with this is change the angle of the brush in your hand. So instead of holding it at a 45-degree angle, hold it vertically. So really tip it up so it's quite vertical. And by doing that, you can start to create little tiny marks. If you don't have it vertical, what will actually happen, as you can see here, you find that you'll end up with small little lines instead of small dots. So make sure that you angle that brush really vertically, okay? Bit difficult for me to show you this on camera because I'll end up covering my painting if I do that. But by doing so, by having the brush vertical, you'll end up with some very fine dots. And stippling is a lovely technique to work with, especially when you're working with different densities of dots. Because the more dots that you put together, the more deeper the area will look. And also it's really good for creating shapes. But as you can see with this butterfly, the effect that we're getting with this already is by creating small tiny marks, texture. So it's really, really good for that. But also it's good for creating not just texture, but also the curves within texture. So try stippling, but remember not to overload that brush when you do so, and keep that brush vertical as well. Now scumbling. This is one of the techniques I love to do in my paintings. It's a good way of having the brush at an angle and using the side of the brush. It's not always the tip of the brush using now. But also, you've got to remember, don't overload it with paint, because when you're scumbling, you want to be able to capture the texture of the paper. So if you're working with a cold pressed or even a rough textured paper, you should be able to pick up the texture and create all different kind of effects within, for example, this dog's tongue, as you can see here. So scumbling is a really good technique to create different textures, different depths of tone as well. And as I mentioned, if you don't overload the brush, you find you'll get some very fine marks. If you put more paint on the brush, then when you're scumbling with that, it could darken, it could fill up an area, well, fairly swiftly as well, but still leave gaps in between. So that's the beauty about scumbling, is that it's not even, and you're working with the paper as well as the brush. So remember, when you're scumbling, just turn the brush, and by playing with both the combination of the paper and of course the brush on its angle, and just don't apply too much pressure either. Give it a try out on some scrap watercolour paper again and see how you get on. I'm sure you'll enjoy this technique. I know I do. Now, a handy technique to use is a shaky hand. Shaky hand? I know. But when you've got a shaky hand, you can create all sorts of textures and marks on the paper at the same time. You really can. And because you haven't got any control, as such, not really, over the shaky hand, it's really useful for creating such a variety of different textures as well. As you can see with the wooden painting now, the texture is quite rough, isn't it? And I want to create like a rough wooden effect. So using a shaky hand with a barely loaded brush can give some lovely, wonderful effects, as you can see here. Vary that pressure of the brush at the same time to create even more effects. And remember that if you've got quite textured paper and you vary those colours as well, the effects are fantastic. So give it a try and try using a shaky hand. Now let's go to one of my videos which are created for my members. This is one of a daisy, but I'm struggling trying to work out how to get the angle that I want to paint. So it's trying to hold that brush in the most comfortable position. So let me show you from this video exactly what I'm advising my members to do. If I move my palette out of the way now, get my hand over there, then I can think about that general kind of arc for this particular petal. So I'm thinking about the way that my hand moves when I'm bringing back and forward my fingers like so. Okay, so remember that. But also what I'm thinking about as well is the wrist movement. So if my wrist movement goes that way, then therefore it's the wrong direction for that curve going that way, isn't it? So it's trying to get the kind of comfortable position when you're working with the lines and trying to get some of those confident strikes, which I'm just trying to get in now for this particular one. So ghost it first of all, so don't touch the paper, just rough out where it's going to go. Then you can bring your brush down and get those confident marks in. Okay? Try to be confident. You can do this. Of course you can. I can't resist it. Let's turn that upside down. That's better. And now I can finally do my lines the right way around. Being a lefty, I know. Oh, by the way, if you do that, you can turn your photograph around on an iPad or tablet or something like that you're using, to the same kind of rotation as that. I can see where all these little lines kind of flick in now towards this orange area. This is better. So I don't normally turn my painting upside down on a camera. No, I don't, not normally. But there's nothing wrong with doing so. At least it kind of demonstrates to you what I can do and what I do on occasions as well, when I find it a little bit awkward to get my hand in the right direction. If you'd like to find out more about the brushes that I like to use, check out the video to the top right. I'll see you there.